Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Sam Lewis, and I'm the Executive Director, and I have the opportunity and the privilege of being able to moderate this panel of incredible human beings and leaders in the field of criminal legal justice reform. First, I'd like to introduce Daryl Atkinson, who is the co-director and co-founder of Forward Justice. At Forward Justice, Atkinson serves in several critical roles, including leading movement building, litigation, advancing public policies that address the needs of people with criminal records, and offering tremendous thought leadership through scholarship and public speaking on the criminal justice, race, and democracy. Give it up for Daryl Atkinson. Thank you for traveling all this way to join us, brother. Next on my panel is Katharine Huffman. Katharine serves as the Executive Director of Square One Project. She is a founding principal at the Raven Group, a national advocacy, strategy, and communications firm based in Washington, D.C. for over 19 years. Her work at Raven has focused primarily on criminal justice reform, civil and human rights advocacy, and evidence-based policymaking. Let's give it up for Katharine. Next up, Jeremy Travis. Jeremy is a senior fellow at the Columbia Justice Lab, a co-founder of Square One Project. Jeremy was previously Executive Vice President of Criminal Justice at Arnold Ventures, where he served 13 years. Criminal Justice at Arnold Ventures. He served 13 years as President of John Jay Criminal Justice and was Senior Fellow with the Justice Policy Center at the Urban Institute, where he launched a national research program on prisoner reentry. He served 6 years as the Director of National Institute of Justice in the Clinton administration. Let's give it up for Jeremy. Nneka Jones, Dr. Nneka Jones Tapia is the Managing Director for Justice Initiatives at Chicago Beyond. She is an experienced psychologist who is passionate about mental health wellness, criminal justice reform, and supporting people who have experienced trauma. Since joining Chicago Beyond in 2018, Dr. Tapia collaborated to launch programs focused on positive family engagement for families who are justice involved, holistic healing supports for Chicago public schools, and peer-led healing supports for youth. She is currently leading the Holistic Safety Action Alliance, a first-of-its-kind multi-state coalition of correctional administrators, former correctional staff, and people formerly incarcerated that will develop strategies to reduce physical and emotional isolation for people working and confined within correctional systems. Let's give it up for Dr. Tapia. And last, but of course not least, Dr. Robert Rooks. Dr. Rooks.
Speak those things as if they were.
Chief Executive Officer of the Reform Alliance, an organization committed to transforming probation and parole by changing laws, systems, and culture to create real pathways to work and well-being. A seasoned organizer and campaigner who has achieved landmark wins in justice reform in multiple states. He is co-founder and former vice president of Alliance for Safety and Justice. Prior to ASJ, Robert was the national campaign justice campaigner expert to work in advanced solutions to criminal justice reform problems through sentencing reform, crime victim advocacy, and advancing new safety priorities. He was the organizing director of the Yes on Prop 47 campaign, a statewide ballot initiative. Prop 47 for California, give it up. A statewide ballot initiative projected to reduce incarceration and reallocate savings to drug treatment, K-12 programming, and victim services, and that is happening right now here in California. Give it up for Robert Rooks. Again, thank you all for joining. So I have a number of questions that we sent out to our community that we like to ask, and then we're going to open it up to our audience for a Q&A for everybody, including myself, but I'm just the moderator. For Jeremy and Daryl, the two of you are national thought leaders in the concept of parsimony, which this book is I meant to stand this up a little while ago. So if you haven't got the book yet, you need to get the book. I read the book. The book is the bomb. It gives you some really radical ideas and thoughts that we need to consider in our country. So can you both tell us a bit more about this concept of parsimony and how can it help reshape the criminal legal system?
He points to me. I think, one of the things that we tried to do with the concept, I think different parts of it really resonated, and each one of us amplified more than the other, right? And at least for me, when I think of parsimony, I think values. What is our Hippocratic oath of our legal system, right? Medical system has a Hippocratic oath, do no harm, that guides everything that they're supposed to do as doctors, nurses, clinicians. What is our Hippocratic oath for the criminal legal system? And for us, we define it as the least intrusive if first of all, the state has to have legitimacy to issue a sanction. And before that can even occur in this country, right, we got some reckoning we need to do before we can even recognize the state as being even legitimate to levy out punishment to the inhabitants of its citizens. And I base this on basic social contract theory, right? Under the social contract, if you break the social contract as a person, the state, if it's legitimate, has authority to levy a sanction. And so what is that contract between people and the state? It's basic, right? You can't have your own militia, your own fire department, your own police force. You cede some of your personal autonomy to the state. And the state, in turn, guarantees you safety, security, and the ability to thrive, right, within its borders. That has never existed for black people in this country. That has never existed for indigenous people in this country. We've never had a binding contract because, I'm a lawyer by training. In contract law, you have what's called a mutuality of obligations that you have to satisfy before you have a binding contract. You have something that you have to do. I have something that I have to do. We have a binding agreement. So under, our nation state laws, the state says, well, we're going to protect you, black people. That has never happened in this country from our moment that we landed here. So we've never had a legitimate contract between our nation state and its inhabitants. Indigenous people can say the same. Many different races can say the same, right? So we got to clean that up before we can have a Hippocratic oath of us moving forward. We just can't move forward like nothing happened. As Malcolm X said, you stab a knife in my back 9 inches, you pull it out 6 and say I'm healed. That isn't the case, right? I still got a wound. And so until that is done, the state really doesn't have a whole lot of legitimacy to punish folks, particularly in the way that it's manifested and throughout its inception. I could go on from convict leasing and chattel slavery to debt peonage to legalized apartheid in the form of Jim Crow, now to mass criminalization and mass incarceration, right? The state got a lot to clean up for, right? And so for us, until that is done, you can't impose this legal Hippocratic oath. But once it's done, even for folks who believe in a complete dissolving of our current system, i.e. abolition, I'm not abolitioning, I'm not dissolving to anarchy. I expect to have some state that I'm going to deal with, some kind of community, some kind of construct of legal system and authority, right? What's going to restrain that legal system? What's going to restrain that state power, even in a new world? We submit that it's parsimony. And the way that you do it is centralizing the liberty interests. And what does liberty mean? The right to be left the fuck alone. The right to be able to do what I want to with my body when I want to do it, right? The right to own my own space, bodily autonomy, human dignity, right? Those are just the basic tenets of liberty. And those are values that cross ideological spectrum. If you're an ACLU type, that might look like let's stop and frisk, right? If you're a small G libertarian, that might look like government run amok, right? Don't tread on me. But the centrality is the liberty interest, right? And we want to use the least intrusive means to impose upon that liberty interest to achieve a legitimate societal purpose. I don't know, Jeremy, you want to fill in the rest of the blanks?
I'll do a bit. Oh, there we go. First, thanks to Sam Lewis and the folks at ARC for hosting us. This is a wonderful gathering in a great space, and we had a really good discussion with the ARC staff over a long lunch today that we will value for a long time. So Parsimony, Daryl and I have been on a multi-year campaign to socialize this concept. And when the opportunity came through the Square One project for us to, as we were spending 3 very intense years together, all of us, twice a year talking about big ideas, and each of us expected to write a paper, Daryl and I connected and said, let's try to write something about this concept that we both think is really important and has been lost in the justice discussion. It's not a new idea. We're trying to give it new life, but it's not a new idea. It goes way, way back centuries. But it is this notion that the state has an obligation to us in the way that Daryl articulated, and that the criminal justice system, the way it operates through the coercive power of the state, needs to have limits that we all understand and buy into. And one of those limits is puts liberty at the center of the discussion, as Daryl said, recognize that in some cases coercive state power may be appropriate, but only if that is in pursuit of a legitimate social purpose. And the kicker in all of this is just to think about if the coercive power of the state is used beyond that legitimate purpose, what we have is state cruelty. So the calculation of parsimony is a way of limiting state power, putting liberty, human liberty, and autonomy at the center of all of our discussions, recognizing that the excess of that, the exercise of state power is so severe that we can call it state-sanctioned violence or cruelty, unnecessary. And if you use that formula, basically, that way of thinking, even in advance of the reckoning process, which we both acknowledge is really important, you can use that as an analytical device to critique any aspect of the criminal legal system. So in our paper, which once you all buy the book, you'll of course want to read it, the opening chapter on parsimony is we take the concept and apply it to, we just picked, not quite at random, but 3 illustrative policies and practices. We looked at solitary confinement, we looked at collateral sanctions, and we looked at, what was the third one, Daryl? We looked at, what? What was it? No. Well, you know, it can be applied to lots of ideas. I'll come up with it in a second. So we used real life examples to put it to the parsimony test. Because the parsimony test is not just a philosophical construct, it's sort of out there. It's a way of critiquing everything that's going on in our society. So I don't expect to see bumper stickers, you know, parsimony today, parsimony now.
I do. I expect
right?
T-shirts.
You do? Okay. But the reason that this has got some sort of leverage is that it is a way for anybody to engage in this conversation. As Daryl said, there's a very strong libertarian streak to this. So when we talk to our conservative colleagues, they get it. They're talking about government overreach. I can talk that talk. When we talk to our more left-leaning colleagues, it's about human rights. We can talk that talk too. When we talk to some of our economist friends about cost-benefit, we can say, what's the benefit of what you're doing? And by the way, what's the cost of $80 billion a year in prisons? So it's a way of unpacking what we're doing and putting it under the microscope. So hence, we titled our chapter, The Power of Parsimony. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeremy and Daryl. Let me just repeat a number. It's $87 billion with a B that we spend every year to incarcerate people. In California, it's $14 billion. Can you imagine the things that we could do in our communities if we use that year by year to do something else with it? Like, just a thought. can make some T-shirts. Dr. Tapia, in Parsimony, you write about ways in which people who come in contact with incarceration, whether they're incarcerated or working in jail or prison, or are family members of people who live or work in jail and prison or are harmed by contact. Can you tell us about your own personal experience with that harm, and how can harm be stopped? How can that harm be stopped, and what should happen instead, please?
I will say my relationship with harm in this whole criminal legal system, but specifically the carceral system, is complex. I am a person who experienced the harm of this system from a very early age. My father was incarcerated when I was younger for possession of marijuana. I've been harmed by this system several times over. I am also a person who worked in this system and was able to reduce some of the harm of the system while I worked in it. And I am a person who inflicted harm on other people while I worked in the system. And so my relationship with harm is a full narrative. And in order to begin to reduce the harm that this system causes, it is going to require all of us to have those honest conversations and to see and to acknowledge the harm that we have been a part of and the power that we have to reduce that. I remember when I was appointed the warden of Cook County Jail, and people were applauding that notion that this clinical psychologist was now running one of the largest correctional institutions in the country, because they thought that a person from the outside who didn't grow up in corrections could really implement radical change. And while that was true, we also have to hold the truth that while I was in that system, I became a part of it. You see, when we have a system that is founded on the principle of punishment meaning the infliction of pain. I want to be clear about what I'm talking about when I say punishment. When we have a system that is based on the principle of punishment, we cannot be surprised when the people who are a part of that system become involved in that cycle of punishment, inflicting pain and having pain inflicted on them. And I was a part of that. So the other thing that I believe it requires in order to reduce the harm of this system is to not only have people working on the inside willing to affect change, but to mostly have people who have been directly impacted on this system who stand outside of it to work for change on the inside of it. And that is the concept that I write about in the book, Holistic Safety. It's really about empowering the people who have been directly impacted by the system to impact change, and not just performative change, but real change.
Thank you so much. Robert and Katharine, in Parsimony, you write about the connection between policy change and actual governing. It's one thing to change a policy, whether through legislation or through a ballot initiative, but it's another thing altogether for that policy to be implemented in ways that will last and will truly reflect the needs of people and communities. How do we make that happen when we work for justice and safety for all?
Thank you, Sam, for the question, and for ARC for organizing this event. I truly appreciated my time with Square One because I often don't have time to stop and think theoretically about what's going on. You know, I have been on the front lines for about 20 years now as an organizer, campaigner, or running organizations that's doing that work. So that was my first time to just step back and say, how is all this stuff connected? If we would go back to square one, what would that look like? And so Katharine and I contribution to the book was based on our experience in California with Prop 47 and how it relates to this conversation around parsimony. And it relates a couple of ways. The first thing we try to bring up or elevate in the context of parsimony is that there's a power relationship there. It's like, in order to be parsimonious, one needs to be in position of governance and have the power to be parsimonious. And so we talked about that clearly, about the role of governance and who's at the table. And the second thing we approached in our chapter was the importance of safety and how we could not just continue to allow law enforcement to control the narrative of safety. And that's really where the story of Prop 47 started. You know, California in 2012, Susan, was very different than California today. It's not saying that things are great now, but things were really screwed up then. We did a lot, right? You know, the California, for those of you that, you know, just unaware of California's history, California was the largest incarcerator in the world, had over 200,000 people incarcerated in its prisons. One person was dying a week as a result of medical neglect, and that triggered the plot of lawsuit. 23 prisons were built in a 25-year a span of time. You have some states that only have 23 prisons, but 23 prisons was built in 25 years in the state of California. And that's just on the kind of structural side. There was a political momentum that was built in California that allowed for a lot of that to happen. And many of us talk about just the role the tough on crime movement had and the amount of power it had in the state of California. And so the actors in that movement were law enforcement, right? Prison guards. California had the largest and most powerful prison guards union in the country. The media, which sensationalized crime and dehumanized specifically young people and black and brown men, and crime victims, right? Which was at that time a very narrow network of folks who represented largely white women that would elevate their cases in ways that facilitated extreme policy change. That was the coalition that built the largest prison system in the country. And so many people tried to make dents at that glacier. For years, activists would organize, go to Sacramento, try to make a change happen. It was just nearly impossible to pierce through that work. And then the Plata lawsuit came. And as I mentioned, one person was dying a week as a result of medical neglect. The Supreme Court mandated California to reduce its prison population and said, either you do it or we do it. Full stop. That's it. And that put the state in a frenzy to try and figure out what it was going to do. Realignment was the first thing that it came up with, but it was woefully inadequate and insufficient. And then it was those of us, David Guizard's in the room, Susan's here, others, where it was our time at bat. And we came up with Prop 47 to try and structurally change how the criminal justice system worked in the state of California. And we addressed it from the structural side. If folks may not realize that Prop 47 took away 1/3 of felony filings, right? 1/3. Through the ballot box after the election on Monday, people walked out of jail, 1/3 of felony filings was taken away out of the justice system. That created an opportunity where up to date, we have seen $500 million reallocated to community from the savings. So money was taken out of prisons and reinvested back in the community. And so that's how we dealt with it from a structural standpoint. From a power building standpoint, we felt it was important to address their coalition with the new coalition. And that's the only way to put it. So we organized a network of crime survivors that elevated their voices around what real safety looks like. We're talking about people in communities that are hit hard by crime and violence, folks that lost their loved ones, to say law enforcement doesn't speak for them. when it comes to safety. We also organized groups to come to the Capitol to make their voices heard. We're talking about civic engagement groups and or groups that had been working in community but never came to the Capitol to talk about justice issues. We partnered with Susan, Oliver Sanan, and others around building out the C3, C4 infrastructure. We were able to get Anthony Thigpen involved in our ballot initiative, and that was his first foray in criminal justice. So we organized a coalition of our own, in addition to forward-thinking law enforcement, to challenge the status quo. And so we won. And we won. That's right, we won. Big win, big win. But then that's when the work begins. And so this chapter really talks about the importance of governance, the importance of making sure that implementation is part of the conversation from the beginning, making sure you have the right coalition, making sure you continue to elevate and not allow law enforcement to control the narrative of safety. So I'll turn it over to Katharine to talk about other pieces.
Great. Thank you, Robert. First, just echoing the thanks to ARC, Sam, Celine, your whole team for hosting us tonight. It's really wonderful to be here with all of you. Also really grateful to MacArthur, the MacArthur Foundation, which supported the executive session, which led to the writing of all these papers and also allowed the production of the book. One quick aside on that. At a book event, usually you get to buy the book at the event. We would have loved for that to happen, but there was a little logistical snafu. So the book is available on Amazon if you're into that kind of thing, also through a number of independent booksellers, and you can order it through some of the independent sites online. So you can, you can have mine, Susan, absolutely, that's yours. But we encourage you to do that, of course. So just to follow on what Robert was saying and what others have been saying as well. So the Square One project was originally developed to try to, for one, give people who are doing the work an opportunity to step back and think about what they're doing and come together. We also very intentionally wanted to build on the incredible work that had been happening in so many places where people had been doing the hard work of nudging and pushing and getting things just right so that a bill could pass or an initiative could pass or other progress could be made. But recognizing that all of that sort of by definition has to be centered around a consensus and has to be centered around kind of a common denominator that folks can settle on. We felt that all of that had led us to a place where we could really step back and think big. What if we could start at a new Square One? What would that look like? What would that even be? And the conversation that very quickly emerged was one around the concept of new values. And I say new values because we needed new values, but also I think our justice system in this country was never aligned with the stated values. You know, you look at any founding document, any mission statement of a correctional issue, whatever, and then you look at what's actually happening, they don't match. That's not what's happening in any one of these places, despite a lot of really good words. And also, in many cases, there isn't any way that those things are even thought about. So when Robert and I started to think about what we could contribute to this undertaking, thinking about the ways in which change is not only about being able to actually pass a law and then check the box and walk away. Change really is about building a new type of power that can bring in the voices of people who know what they want, which is all of us. Let's be clear, everybody knows what they want, right? And just that not everybody gets to say what they want or gets to have the power to implement what they want. And bringing those folks into the conversation is step one, but then also not assuming that once you change words on paper, that suddenly all the same systems and structures that have for years, decades, millennia, not done what they were, but done things a certain way, that they're suddenly going to change and do that differently. And that's where the brilliance of Prop 47, one of the many brilliances of that, and also that I think a lot of different advocates and organizers and activists and systems people and legislators and others around the country are learning is that when carrying the power sharing through to the governance is the really important piece. And that's where you can build the type of power that can then be used to hold us all accountable to the values that we bring. So if parsimony is the principle that's going to guide the way that we think about our justice system, we need to have people in places of power in order to use parsimony as the measure, as the value, as the guide to the way that the system's going to run, the way that decisions are going to be made, the way that laws are going to be passed, all of those things. And the same is true for other values that emerge through the work that Square One is doing, that are emerging in the work that I see people around the room, and I know what some of you are doing, that it's emerging in a lot of different places. That's the way that we can bring some of those values about parsimony, about reckoning, about power sharing to bear in a way that is real and that is sustainable. And I just want to say one more thing, which is, having worked for many years on advocacy and on, the sort of well-focused group ways of talking about certain things so that you could get them to happen. The other thing that the Square One project has really surfaced is that unless and until we reckon with this history, we're going to be doomed to repeat it over and over again. And so as we're moving forward from all the work that the executive session and the people who contributed to this book did, we're really now thinking about, and invite everyone to join us in thinking about, what does it mean to reckon with that history? What does that actually look like? What are the places and the ways in which that should happen? And how can we actually turn that part into a reality as well? So all of that is part of what comes out of the type of power sharing, the type of power building, the type of power taking that we talk about in the chapter that we wrote in the book, and that also really sort of influences all the work that Square One has been doing. So,
Thank you, Robert and Kathleen, so much. To give you some more numbers to just consider, in 2012, California had approximately 174,000 people incarcerated in prison cells and out of state. Today, we're at about 94,000. That's an 80,000 human being difference, still way too many people in prisons. We were at 35 prisons, we're now at 32, about to be 31. So there's change being made, but it's not enough. But that's also through policy and implementation of that policy. And so we see that that it can be done, but I think we have to ask ourselves, how much further can we push it? Because I believe, as in this book, we have to think more radically of how we transform or change this system if we really want something that's better for our communities. With that said, I'd like to ask the entire panel, parsimony and other radical ideas about justice. Each chapter was subject. Each chapter that each of you wrote was subject to questions, ideas, expansions, critiques, and discussions of the entire group. What did that process contribute to the individual chapters in the book as a whole, and how did they come or not come together? Because you have different perspectives being debated as a group. How did that come? And then, so that's one part of my question. The second part, outside of your own chapter that each of you wrote or co-wrote, what is your favorite chapter in the book and why?
I'll take the first one. The second one sounds a little dangerous. So as my colleagues have described it, the Square One process is, I'll say, unlike anything any of us has been through before. And what made it different, and what helped in the production of this volume. So 20, almost 30 of us met twice a year for 2+ days in closed session. Door was closed. It was there's a rule that we couldn't talk about what happened outside of that room. It was recorded and taped for transcript purposes, but not for public release. It was a facilitated conversation. I was a facilitator. Our colleague, we should just thank him for his role here, was Bruce Western, who you saw on the video. And we didn't know where the conversation was going to go. That was the beauty of it. We all just sort of held hands and jumped off into the deep end of the pool. And that first session that we had was just electrifying. And we had some big minds around the table, but no big egos. Everyone was willing to listen to each other, to test each other. We certainly didn't agree all the time. We had some people of different political stripes, practitioners, elected officials, academics. But what was the commitment at the beginning was that each of us, as a ticket of admission, price of admission, would agree to write or co-author a paper on something that emerged and sort of caught your fancy during those discussions. And so you saw Nneka on the screen, the manager of the executive session, would go around after each session and say, well, are you ready to tell us what you're going to write yet, and try to sort of coax people into writing? So the paper ideas were not, I've been part of the other format of edited volumes, academic volumes, where there are editors or co-editors get together and they say, okay, we want to publish a volume on topic X. Who's writing about topic X? And you come up with a list of scholars and you say, okay, I'm going to call all of them, see if they'll contribute a chapter, and they pull something off the shelf or they write something that they've already written before. But it's not a collaborative production of those chapters. It's an individual production that gets put into a volume. This volume, it looks like an edited volume, and it is entirely different. So each paper idea became a discussion at the next session. So one of us would say, I'm thinking about writing a paper, or if you're really bold, you'd actually try to start to put something into a format, and then you get feedback from your colleagues. You try to figure out, so what am I learning from this back and forth? And then when the paper is a draft, it goes back into the group. So it's not a consensus process. We're not looking for agreement, but we're looking for shared ideas and honest discussion. So I remember, without disclosing who said what, when we put our Parsimony paper into this mix for the first time, we got some really sort of strong pushback about sort of what we were thinking about. Was it realistic? Was it not? And that, we benefited from that. Each paper went through that process. At the end of we went through the COVID pandemic time together, which was hard to do remotely, but as we ended, we sat back and realized, well, in the papers that have been produced, there's a volume. And we went to our publisher, the New Press, and said, this is unlike any other volume in our field. First of all, it represents a variety of perspectives, but it's also just a lot of fresh ideas. There's nothing new, but they just sort of have a freshness to them. The publishers read them and said, okay, you got a book, let's put it together. So the hope is that as you all go buy your book, we don't get royalties, but you go buy your book and you'll read it, you'll find, particularly if you're doing this work, but even more so if you're not, if you're here just as a sort of citizen interested in this work, please sort of think about how it shapes your thinking about the way this system of all these agencies and laws, and it's on TV every night, how it's actually operating. The hope is that the chapters, as they emerged from the executive session and are now in the volume, will inform the discussion about, we call it rethinking justice. The whole mission of Square One is rethinking justice to help create an operational or a sort of a vision of what justice could look like if we were serious. That's why the paper that's been produced on the governance question is so important. It's about organizing, it's about politics, about doing the hard work, but you have to do that hard work for a goal, and hopefully an elevating goal, so people say, I want part of that. And that's what we hope to produce in the volume.
I don't have a favorite paper, but something that I appreciated of the process that I think is universal, that's transferable to wherever you are and whatever kind of work you're doing, was that Millsian approach, right? The marketplace of ideas. Bring your ideas, and the best ideas rise to the top, and you got to be able to defend your position, right? And through that process, we had, as Jeremy said, people from different disciplines. Lawyers think differently than social scientists, think differently than community organizers. And we also had people from different political and ideological perspectives, right? And I think it's something that's really been lost in this country over the last however many years, of having real conversations with people who think very different than you, and having them test your positions and you testing their positions, right? And doing that in a way that is respectful and It honors rigor and what the evidence says and not fake facts, right? But really trying to follow the truth and in the pursuit for truth, right? That was one of the process points that I think is critically important, because we were doing that, and I told Nneka earlier today, you know, our relationship forced me not to caricature correctional officers. I'm a formerly incarcerated person. I did prison in Alabama in the mid-1990s where chain ganging was still legal. I was on prison farms. I don't think of those people nicely when I reminisce on that time, right? But our relationship forced me, right, not to caricature them, just like I don't want them to caricature me, right? And so that really struggling through that together with people from different perspectives is immensely important. It has probably been the secret sauce to any real transformative change and work that I've been a part of. Because you know what you figure out? That person over there doesn't have 6 arms and 5 heads. They're not a monster. They drop their kids off at school just like me. They're worried about doing the laundry, going grocery shopping, all of the real world pressures that I have, they have them too. We just think about stuff different, right? You know what I mean? So you can't think of them as the other. As a result, you have to deal with them as a human being, right? That was immensely important for police to see formerly incarcerated people that way, for formerly incarcerated people to see prison guards and police that way. It's our shared humanity, right? We talk about human dignity. If I want human dignity as a formerly an incarcerated person, I got to be able to extend that same dignity to the people who are working in the system, right? And that really, like, I would be unsettled at times with that. It was not comfortable, right? Because we like our caricatures. We like our schemas. They're easy. They're comfortable. When you have to break out of that, it's uncomfortable, right? When you have to see people different. And so whenever you have that opportunity, particularly in this criminal legal system work, is critically important because it's built on caricatures and stereotypes about the other, the secret boogeyman lurking around the corner who's gonna get you, right? And it makes us all get into our tribalism. So whenever we can lean into that, I would encourage you to lean into it. And that's a universal process, no matter where you are and what you're doing.
Was that a microphone drop moment? Thank you so much. So if you haven't had an opportunity to read the 1619 Project, I would really ask that you do. It's like, if I were to describe it, it's just history. It's an ugly history, but it's history. And it's history of this country. But that doesn't mean that that history has to be where we live today. But we have to be aware of it and be willing to face it to be able to transform what we have today. And so that leads me for the panel. I'd love for you. One of the main themes throughout the book is a focus on the reckoning, or a reckoning. Why is reckoning so important to achieving racial justice and overhauling the criminal legal system? And given the political attacks on critical race theory and the 1619 Project, what do you think the appetite around the country is for that conversation?
I'm going to take the first part. I think for me, reckoning is like twofold. It's about humanization that Daryl spoke about. Like, reckoning requires us to fully see people and to fully hear people, like to bear witness. And there is a humanizing component to that. There is also a vulnerability in that. Reckoning for me is also about finding the pathway forward. Like, reckoning starts with an acknowledgement, right, of the harm that has been done. And then once you acknowledge that harm, it's about what am I going to do now to ensure that I do not continue to cause harm? And that requires us to think about action. So we don't just stay stuck in the theory and the pragmatic schemas, but to actually put our words into action. For the last part, is this country ready for that? I think there are many of us who are, and the many of us who are can push the needle. And I don't think we can afford to wait for everyone to be ready to have that conversation. But if many of us have it, we've already talked about all the many changes that have happened from the many, and I think that can continue.
I'll just, building on that, Nneka, thinking about the concept of reckoning, when you look at the history of this country, which from the very earliest colonialistic arrivals of white settlers from other countries, we started needing a reckoning at that moment, if not earlier. And over the many, many centuries since then, we have not ever, as a nation, thought seriously about that, tried to think through how we could possibly do that, engaged it in any real way. When we look at, there are examples of other countries that have tried to do this. You look at South Africa, you look at New Zealand and Australia, you look at Brazil, you look at Northern Ireland. There are a number of places that have tried to undertake a reckoning with their own history as a nation. When you think about the power dynamics of nations and the ways in which history develops, many, many places have tried to look at this. And one of the things that is very common when you look at all of those countries is that, like you were saying, Nneka, very rarely does it happen because suddenly there was a national act of whatever their Congress is that it said, we're going to start reckoning now. And then they do it. Not never. There are places where pieces that have been national, but usually what happens is people in different places involving different parts of society start to think about what does this look like and start to say, let's look at our own history in this locality. Let's look at our history in this state, maybe. Let's look at our history even in this region and come together to have that deeply uncomfortable, to say the least, and that deeply challenging conversation that depends on recognizing the human dignity of every other person at the table, the people who have been perceived to be the victims of history, the people who have been perceived to be the powerful of history. Everyone is harmed by the history of white supremacy and racism in this country. Everyone is harmed by that. Everyone in different ways, let's be very clear. But in order to engage together, to be able to build the relationships, to be able to build the space for those conversations, that's a real process that actually takes time and effort. And so, as we think about in this country, what are we ready for? It's going to look really different in different places. And it's going to be 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, another step back, and another step, and then maybe a few more steps forward. This is something that's going to take a long time. We didn't get here quickly. And the more that we start to see these examples of people who are making efforts to come together, people who are looking at ways to build power and bring their own voices to the table, people who are looking at ways to actually create the space for that to happen in a very real way, then we're going to be able to start to normalize that process, give people models and examples of that process, begin to be able to make it something that eventually will make a real difference. And one more quick thing, until we do that, any change that we're able to make is going to be stopgap, and we're going to be constantly at the mercy of the changing winds of time. And we're seeing that now when we think about progress that's been made in many ways on justice issues and a lot of other issues where we're feeling the backlash. I would love to think that's just sort of the dying throes of something, but I think it's just evidence that we haven't done the reckoning work yet, and we really need to figure out how to do that. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Sam, thanks for that question. In your question, you referenced the 1619 Project and debate around critical race theory, which are sort of the national conversation sort of static on this issue. And that's a reality that we just have to deal with in some way. But by the Square One group leaning into the reckoning as the next phase of our work, we're doing our part, trying to think about what that looks like and what it means in this way that I've described before. But I think the larger point to make here is that this reckoning process can be and more importantly, should be very localized. So I was listening to Robert's description of and Sam, you said this too, the buildup of prisons in California, the ramping down of it's not rapid, but the size of the prison population, the money spent, that recognition begins a reckoning process. What we don't do as Americans is say, well, let's sort of tally that up and ask ourselves, Parsimony, was that necessary? Well, of course not. Well, if it wasn't necessary, why did we do it? Deeper discussion. If we understand better why that happened and really come to terms with that sort of explanatory narrative, how do we make sure, as Nneka said, that we don't do that again? And how do we make sure that actually we don't just hold the line, but we're doing something very different? So one of the projects I'm involved with now at the Justice Lab at Columbia is looking at, we call it the Neighborhood Justice Project, but it's looking at the history of mass incarceration in New York City over 40 years to try to understand the impact of that on the neighborhoods of New York. If you want a book recommendation other than ours tonight, I'll recommend a book by Jessica Symes called Punishing Places. So she did this analysis in the state of Massachusetts. She's an academic at Boston University, protege of Bruce's, who just did all the data work, but then said, well, how does this look from a community point of view to have embarked on this unprecedented, mass incarceration is not just a phrase, it's a policy choice that we made as a country. It has nothing to do with crime rates. It's because we elected all those tough on crime people who said, well, guess what we're going to do to get elected? We're going to be tougher than we've ever been. And that'll get us elected again. And guess what? It worked for Democrats, I hate to say this, and Republicans alike. So we've been through this traumatic national experiment, terrible thing to think of as an experiment, but this history, this chapter, where we quadrupled the rate of incarceration in America. So the consequences of that are profound. Money is one thing, that's easily documented. We have a colleague in Michigan, Heather Ann Thompson at the university, who's a historian, and she has decided in her state to activate her doctoral students to collect the oral history of mass incarceration in Michigan. They are interviewing the children of incarcerated parents. They're interviewing the correction officers who worked in those prisons. They're interviewing the state legislators who passed those laws. We're talking about what is the history that we have, how would historians describe what we've gone through, and would it be the end of the story, just that description, or is there something deeper that is a process of reckoning? And if there is, let's start that now. That could happen at a very local level. It could happen at a state level. I doubt it's going to happen at a national level. That would be something else to think about. But there's no reason it can't start. And it could be very personal in the way that some of us in the Square One process are now thinking about this. What was our role in this chapter of history? It can be institutional. What was the role that various agencies played? It could be very political. What was the narrative? But it's really deeply affecting the trauma and the health and the well-being of communities that have been affected by this ramp up of this very damaging policy choice called policing and incarceration. And we can sort of say that's over. It's not, but we can say maybe it's never been it's the worst. We're through the worst of it. That's the way sometimes we think about illness. It's over, but that's not curing, to use that example, anything that's deeper than that. So that's the reckoning process, going much deeper than the symptoms.
Thank you. We're pressed for a little pressed for time, not really, but.
You got books, though.
We get to the books, but I want to open it up to the audience for Q&A. But I'd like to also add, once again, when we think about one of the things that was said nationally by the governor of Florida was Florida is where woke comes to die. The definition of woke means to just know history. And that term has just been hijacked. It's just to know the history of our country. Is it a pretty history? No. But if you think about it just worldwide, histories are not beautiful, nice puppy dogs and tulips. That's just not history. History is rough. Humanity is rough. Like regular everyday life, if you think about it, life is beautiful peaks and sometimes dark valleys where we lose loved ones and we go through struggle. Like, think about the 60s, the assassinations and things, the difficulties that this country has gone through. Let's address our history so that we can heal, move forward, and do better. In order to do that, we have to be willing to just say, that's what's happened, let's recognize it. Now, how do we move forward from this? But first, we have to have the discussion, and that can start, in my humble opinion, organically, where people can have those discussions with friends, and then those friends who live in different states who may have different political beliefs. If you know Trey Gowdy, he ended up being who I consider a friend. Totally different political views, and he came to believe that a person, even if they harm someone, should be able to have a second chance. At one point, he didn't believe that. But because of the friendship, being able to talk and have those discussions, his position changed. And when you think about that, if that's the way we do it, we need to be willing to be proactive enough to have those conversations, first maybe in smaller groups and then bigger in national groups. We're not going to all agree. I'm pretty sure we all have family members we don't agree with, but they're still our family. With that, I want to open it up for questions for our audience. Can I get somebody to run the mic? Okay.
All right. So this is to everyone, but this is stemming off of what Dr. Tapia and Robert were talking about. So Dr. Tapia, you talked about empowering people that were impacted by the system to advocate for these changes. And then, Robert, you talked about having these networks of crime survivors advocating at the capitals. Do you find that there's a difference in approach for how much they advocate or their motivations, whether they're impacted by the system or not, in advocating for more parsimony into the system?
Yeah, I'll take on the first question. What our work at Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice showed were that we're talking about the same individuals, the same families, the same communities, right? It's just this idea of a crime victim being used politically was only designed to justify the incarceration of people, right? It's not, you know, we would have in our meetings individuals who themselves was both a victim of crime and someone that had spent time. In our meetings, a mother who would say she advocated for her sons when they were 11, but now she has one in a cemetery and one in prison, right? And so our work started to uncover that the crime victims' rights movement, right, was a movement that was politically designed to grow bureaucracy. It was not designed to solve real problems. And so when we began to organize, we started to center not just survivors, but what were the solutions for community in the conversations of what we should be talking about politically. So we kind of turned it on its head. I hope that answered your question.
It definitely does. Thank you.
I would add to that the buildup of silos, I think, works to the benefit of the system. And not only are people not a monolith, like you look at me, I'm a person whose parent was incarcerated. I am a system actor. I am the wife of someone who works in the system. Like, there are so many different avenues aspects to this work that we all bring. So that was one that I agree with Robert, that was a learning factor in bringing different groups together. And also, I think the lack of education about the impact of the system serves the system too. And so while people may think coming into a room together that they have divergent thoughts, when they have meaningful conversations about what they want out of the system, it turns out to be the same thing. Like, we all want to feel safe. And that brings us back to like parsimony and the social contract. Like, we have never felt safe. And we give people space, whether you're coming from working in the system, whether you are a traditional like survivor group, whether you are someone formerly incarcerated, like, we want to feel safe. And in that, we want the ability to thrive. It's not just about the physical security or the reduction of harm, but it's also about making sure that we have the tools and the resources that we need to take care of ourselves and our loved ones. And we have never had that. And when we come into that space together and all of us agree on that, and all of us agree on the things that we need in order to get there, like that's a starting point. Don't get me wrong, we don't agree on everything, but you start from the areas of agreement and you build on that.
Thank you so much.
And then Susan, after, and then Susan.
I'll just stand up really quick. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the panel. It's been really informative. With regards to the reckoning and how everyone's been saying it starts small, it starts within your communities. And me being from the East Coast, I see that a lot of people in this room and the people I've interacted with in Los Angeles are very much on the same page for a lot of things that we're all discussing today. But on the national lens, do you think, is it reparations? Is that the thing to strive for? Is that where the reckoning comes? What can the government do? And I know we've referred to New Zealand and Brazil and other countries. I know the U.S. is its own unique atmosphere. I guess the question is reparations what we're striving for, and what does reckoning look like on a national level?
I mean, for me, yes. I want to go back to the appetite question, though. Is the country ready for it? I think, no shade, that ain't the right question. Because the country has never been ready for it. The country wasn't ready for it when David Walker made his appeal. The country wasn't ready for it when Dr. King wrote his letter from the Birmingham jail and when he had his speech at Riverside denouncing the Vietnam War and calling for a new poor people's campaign and economic justice. That's when he really got villainized. Not when he was just a civil rights advocate, but when he started really going at some of the international and the economic stuff. So the country has never been ready for truth tellers. And at this point where we are really litigating what's true and false in the national discourse, I think it's even more important for griots. And that's a African word, traditional storyteller, truth teller, right? I think it's even more important for truth tellers to tell the truth, irrespective of the political conditions, not worrying about the political calculations. Because right now there's literally a fight about what is the truth and what is false.
Let me add this. Everybody's aware of board versus education. I remember reading, I believe it was in Thurgood Marshall's biography, there was an argument that the country's not ready for this. And Thurgood said, they'll never be ready, but we're going to move forward. That's a reality. Will it ever be perfect conditions? No. But we have to push forward. And I think organically, if we begin to have those conversations, I have two cousins that are like super conservative. Let's have that conversation. Let's start with you and bring some of your friends. Let's just sit in the backyard and have this discussion and have it where like we just want to talk about it and then see if we can make it a little bit bigger. Who do you know that we can invite to one of these? We can call them talk parties. I don't know what you want to call them, but we bring people in and you make those conversations bigger and bigger. And then, what is truth? 1619 is just, it's history. It's the truth. That's what happened. Like,
But I don't even want to go, I don't even think we have to take it back to 1619, Sam. And one of the things that Ta-Nehisi Coates did so wonderfully in his article, The Case for Reparations, he really made a contemporary case. Yeah. And I think we have a strong contemporary case now. Right? When you think of basic tenets of negligence, was there a duty of care? Did you owe a duty of care? Were you negligent? Did someone suffer a harm? Were you the cause of the harm, right? And I think we got a pretty strong case that but for the United States and their war on crime and their war on drugs, right? We would have a lot more people in our communities, a lot more people who would be contributing to their communities. We would have stronger, more vibrant, virtuous communities. And the limitations or the weaknesses of most contemporary reparations arguments is the administrability of it. not whether someone actually suffered an injury and we owe to make that person whole. That really isn't debatable.
You mean remedy, right? Like what's the
What's the remedy? How are we going to pay them out, right? Who gets it? You know what I mean? And we'd go through all of this navel gazing about it, which causes us to, not take action, right? We don't have that problem with the drug war and mass incarceration. Because I got 188861. That's my prison number. I'll never forget it. And it's a lot of people who got those numbers that we can directly trace. We know who those people are. We know the communities that they came from. We can GIS map it all the way down to the census tract and give it out in community development block grants to those communities who suffered the harm most. This is easy, y'all. You know what I mean? This is really clean. And I think, it should be a domestic Marshall Plan to undo everything this country has done since Nixon started the war on drugs, and really even predates Nixon, but he's really the main culprit. From that point on, we don't have to go back to 1619. From that point on, we can make a cogent case for reparations.
W31416 was my number. And I don't think reparations or any of that can replace or do good or heal what's been done to us since the 1619. And the hurt, the harm, the rape, the kidnap, the capitalism, all of this that built this system, I think about this, and I've been where I've went into places and I've tried to do good. And I became a part of the problem. It got difficult to sleep at night because I was just showing up and wasn't nothing changing. Do you actually believe, any of you or all of you, that putting a noble, good person that's coming to do the good work and do the good deeds in those systems is going to have any effect? Or is the system just going to eat that person up?
Not by itself, not a sole individual, right? We got to try to create a critical mass. You know what I mean? I understand your point.
You in DOJ.
One individual in an institution, that's like trying to, the system is DOJ, like main justice was the Titanic. And trying to shift that quickly is impossible, right? So one person isn't going to be able to do that. But people do matter. And having the right people within institutions mattered. And I learned that from it wasn't the right work for me long term, but you want to have good people there, right? You want to have people who have a moral compass, who believe in principles of justice. Otherwise, we're at the mercy of, bad actors running the system, right? So system work isn't necessarily right for me. I don't think one person can change things, but people do matter.
Yeah. Well, Susan.
And then I got to hear.
Oh, yeah. Well, let me see if I can set that up. We have to do it all. Right? And we have to do it all because there are people right now in cages that need us to do it all, right? So do we need to be talking about 1619 reparations and all that and talk about where we're going or where we need to go? Absolutely. Do we need advocates going in, working with systems leaders as partners to figure out how we can get more and more people out each and every day, each year, more and more? Absolutely, right? And you have to do what you are comfortable doing. So if you're someone that can go into a system and work and collaborate and partner with advocates on the outside, we need you in there. Like, it's a very different dynamic today. There are more folks on the inside that agree with us that we can work with than it was when I started this 25 years ago. It's a very different dynamic. So we need people on the inside to work with them to get who we can get out now while we have this kind of broader, larger structural conversation about where we're going.
Most of the people in the society do not know what happens within these systems. Like, the system is opaque for a reason, because they don't want people outside of the system to be able to affect change. And so it takes people, good people with good intentions to go in and affect change and to open up the veil so that people from the outside can support that work as well. Because you can't do it alone from any angle. Like Robert and like Daryl said, it takes all things.
Can I give a really quick example of how the inside and the outside game worked and how a system actor can make a difference? So in 2018, we ran an insurgent candidate for our district attorney in Durham, North Carolina. Black queer woman named Satana D. Berry. She had never had any prosecutorial experience. She was coming from a public health model. She won. We were able to get her to win 51 to 48, right? She won 51% of the vote to 48% of the vote. Since her tenure, the Durham-based prison population has reduced by 33%. She's waived over $5 million in debt, and she's done look-back cases for over 50 people who had served over 15 years. That's one DA who changed the culture of that office to produce those outcomes, right? Is that my work? No, but I want a good person in that role who would be willing to do those things, right? To think transformatively that can change the material conditions of our people. So it's a both and. There is no one thing. We got to do, as Robert said, we got to do everything. We got to do a lot of stuff all at once, because mass incarceration was incrementally built. Unfortunately, it ain't one lawsuit or one piece of legislation that's going to bring it all the way down. We're going to have to dismantle it piece by piece.
I want to add one piece to this. Tuesday, I was in CCWF, one of the two women's prisons here in California, for a graduation for our Hope and Redemption team. And today I sent an email with, I think, 10 support letters for resentencing for all of these. And this was just, I happened to be in there, and they were like, we didn't get support letters. And I was like, for what, resentencing? So I'm writing down names. All of these women are going before, because of district attorneys. System change that are being, not just LA, there are other places. Like, this is also part of the system change that was funded, we were talking about by Arnold and
Hillary's project.
Hillary's project, right. And so that's a systems change. People are being resentenced to lower terms and coming home. People are, like, those system change. Systems are made up of what? People. If we push the right people in those positions and we support them, and we make sure that we support them, that we're the loudest, that we show up to support them, whether it be in the voting box or we're coming to give public comments on a local level at the Board of Supervisors, those systems can be changed by the people that are in them. A system, like if we were to say, we could make this could be a prison. It's a building. That's all it is. What we make of it is what we decide to make of it.
I'd like to, with apologies to our friend in the audience here, to use the reparations example just to make another point. The reparations conversation too quickly devolves, in my view, into two statements that are sort of conversation stoppers. One is, where's the money come from, who's going to get it, and how do you decide? But the other is, I wasn't there, says somebody who has to make a decision. Like, I remember when Ta-Nehisi Coates testified before Congress about reparations, and Mitch McConnell said, I wasn't born then. Oh, God, give me a break. Right? So it's too easy to say I wasn't there. When we talk about what we're talking about as a place to start, which is the era of punitive excess, mass incarceration, what we've been through over the last 40 years, most people in these legislative positions either were there or they were coming up through the system and were there, and people who run these agencies. So the way of sliding off the hook of accountability, which is say, I wasn't there for, therefore I can't engage. We can't let people be comfortable by saying I wasn't there. So Bruce and I were involved in another project years ago. Katharine was there too. The National Academy of Sciences report on how did mass incarceration come about. The bottom line of that is, and I use this in speeches all the time, it sort of gets people a little uncomfortable, that's fine. We are here, quadrupling the incarceration rate, because we chose to be here. We, it's all of us. And people say, oh, I didn't choose that. Well, we did. Our democracy did. We voted for these people. This was the way people got elected. And it was DAs, and that's why the progressive prosecutor movement is so important. It's using democracy for advantage to leverage change. But every one of those state officials, state legislators who voted for the laws that your state and my state as well enacted, they may not be the same people now, but it's those bodies that got us where we are. So you can turn that around and say, well, guess what? You now have responsibility for getting us out of here, and we're going to hold you to account. The flip side of the reckoning is accountability. And accountability can be a very present concept. Like right now, what are we doing now? And everybody who's here and everyone who sort of thinks about these things should think about what are we going to do now in the way that organizers talk about it to sort of get us out of where we are. And we can rail against the system, and it's all systems, but it's ultimately people who make decisions, and it's ultimately, in my view, politicians who make decisions. That means it's ultimately about us doing the organizing work through our democracy. And if our democracy got us here, it's our democracy that's going to get us out of here, which means it's an organizing activity that's required. Otherwise, we're stuck.
Last question here, and then what the plan is, we have some books. If our amazing panel are willing to sign these books, I want to sign a book too, but I want our audience to go first. But I think the work in these books is amazing, and I know when you read it, you'll probably want to share it with other people so they can go on Amazon and purchase them. But
is it on? Yes. All right. So I guess since we're sharing, I got a few numbers. My California Youth Authority number was 74441. My CDC number was T230075. And I'm forgetting the first couple digits of my federal, but the last 3 digits are all ones from Northern District, from Santa Clara. So I'm very familiar with mass incarceration. Thank y'all for all your amazing work. This concept, I get it, because we're fighting for budgets on all levels, right? I get this concept. Thank you for your work. I think my question is, what are we going to do to ensure like this type of amazing work, concepts, theories, et cetera, is not co-opted to continue to really just rely? Because what I'm seeing right now is like I've been home for 10 years now. I'm with the California Alliance for Youth and Community Justice co-convener, and we've done amazing things in 10 years, yes? Yeah. But then like, the reality also is like there's a bill that flew through, $1 billion coming to LA probation, right? There was another $1 billion for like correctional officer bonus packages and like, so that's one question is like, well, how are we going to protect the vitality, the fidelity and the righteous intention with everything that we do, one, and then two is how do we keep our folks united when things like this create a bunch of divisions and so on. So thank you.
I really appreciate the question because it's on a lot of our minds right now. Right, our movement is in it's in an interesting place because of a lot of things, right? You know, some of it had to do with coming on the back end of COVID. We were disconnected as a community, right? We were not able to have meetings like this. We were not able to build, right? It was all Zoom calls. It also had to do with the fact that our people were disconnected from the systems that supported them. So when they came out, you know, they had increased mental health suicide. There's a lot's been going on, addiction, and that's kind of showing up in different ways. You know, the politicians do what politicians do, right? They're blaming reform for what's been happening, the spikes, as if we didn't just go through 2.5 years of COVID. And as someone that helped shape and pass Prop 47, like, we're on the news every night. We've been on the news every night for the last 10 years. And so those attacks will continue. I think it's important for us. Actually, this is the opportunity for me to tie it back to, I think, the second question, which was about one of the values or takeaways of Square One. You know, my first Square One meeting, it was very interesting. I found myself opposite of, we won't say the name, but a Princeton professor who was challenging us on our notion of safety. Like, he was pushing back, like, you know, how do you know you can deliver better safety? And I appreciate that, because I felt I was more prepared for the last couple of years where we were being blamed in terms of what was going on, and we began centering our work around solutions, right? Like, sometimes you have to kind of restructure and reform your work in a way that increases your effectiveness. And for me, centering solutions and saying we can find solutions and still, reform or significantly reduce incarceration is still possible. It's actually the only way to do it. The only way to achieve safety is to shrink the system. And so it's just, to me, as of late, it's put more onus on us to be part of the solutions business, not only part of kind of the advocacy business. And that's what we're doing. That's what I know other groups. That's what y'all are doing. And so we just need to kind of restructure and bring the resources in that allows us to do it and organize our communities along those lines.
Can I just add one thing building on that, and also building on a conversation we had with the ARC staff earlier today, that, you know, part of the way that we can, I want to say immunize, that we can protect ourselves from the type of pushback, the type of backlash that we are all seeing and feeling in the work that we're doing, is by really thinking about how do we tell a different story. It's what you were saying earlier. We all know that lots of things are happening in communities all over this country where safety is being created, where work is happening, where people are reckoning with their past, where people are coming together and acknowledging the human dignity of each other. But we don't hear about that very much. That does not have a comms campaign around it most of the time. So number one, maybe a comms campaign, that could be good. But also, that's where, when we think about the work that we're doing in whatever form that takes, to be able to really not see the storytelling and not see the acknowledgement of that way in which we talk about it and the things that we share with others as central to the work. That's not extra. That's central to the work if we want it to be something that will last beyond where we are able to check a box because a ballot initiative was passed or a piece of legislation was passed.
I heard the question a little bit different. When you said co-optation, it made me think of Black Panther Party, feeding the kids, and then we have government Head Start. It made me think about reentry wasn't even a term until Jeremy Travis introduced it. Now we got sheriffs and probation departments talking about they're going to do employment training. You know what I mean? Like, they're getting in the reentry game now. That's what I heard in your question. And how do we protect against that? It's a double-edged sword, right? Because on certain level, we want government to do some things, right? We just want them to stay in their lane. You know what I mean? Like, we should have a request that government, they help create this problem, that they should help fill the gap in this problem. And one of the things that it's a burgeoning literature that's starting to build, but one of the things that I'm really interested in learning more about is kinship reentry. That we don't give the money to government, we don't give it to no nonprofit, we give it to the families who taken in Ray and Shaquita and got them on the couch and got them downstairs. Let's give the money directly to those families, just like we do with foster care. You know what I mean? Kinship reentry, because the biggest reentry service provider in this country It's family. Real talk. That's who took me in. You know what I mean? It ain't these big mega nonprofits, right? So why don't we create a system that facilitates the reentry by feeding and giving the money to the families who taking these folks in? That'll keep it out of government hands.
Let's give it up for our panel.
I'm gonna put my mental health hat on for a second, and I just had to say that we also have to recognize that this work is taxing, this work is exhausting, and so we need to make space for rest. Like he asked the question about community building and how do we stay together, like we have to be able to tap in so others can tap out, and we have to also hold ourselves accountable and our colleagues accountable to taking care of ourselves. I wanted to just mention that because I know all of you are doing important work in this room, and I just urge us to just make space for rest.
Thank you. Again, give it up for our panel.